Welcome to this masterclass on all things communication, more specifically looking at communicating with your customers and pitching your business as effectively as possible. I'm Jenna and I'm delighted to take you through the workshop today. And there are 4 key areas that we're going to be looking at. The first thing we're going to explore is compelling people. What is it that makes someone compelling when they communicate? The second thing is looking at the key pillars of communication. We're then going to explore the basics of pitching and finally ending with ways to engage our audience. So let's dive in and get started. Now, there are 2 key things to think about when we look at compelling people. You've got their strengths and their people skills. So these are the 2 things to think about. You've got the personal strengths of someone and also the ability to engage and build a rapport with their audience. Now, I'm going to be focusing on, for the next section, mainly the strength side, and these can be broken down into 3 key areas. You've got your mental strength, your emotional strength, and your verbal strength. And all of this is really key to communicating with more impact, so we can make more of an impact when we're communicating with our customers, as well as those opportunities to pitch our businesses. So kicking off with the mental strength, and this really relates to our mindset. Think about situations that you go into, whether that is presenting yourself, pitching your business, for example, experiences that might make us a little bit nervous. Really think about your mindset when you go into these situations. And I encourage you to adopt a positive mindset and visualize what success looks like for your next presentation, your next pitch, maybe your next conversation with a potential customer. So often we tend to focus on what's the worst that could happen. Instead, I really want you to make a conscious effort to focus on what's the best thing that could happen in this situation and really visualize what success looks like for you. So that's the first strength, is our mindset, and using it in a way that's really going to help us make an impact. The second strength that we're still speaking about is emotional strength. And this can be conveyed through our body language. Now, I've broken this down into 3 areas. Body language makes up so many different areas, but posture, facial expressions, and your gestures, like hand gestures, are really key when you're presenting. And we're going to come on to some key tips in using our body language to convey confidence and also impact and credibility to our audience as well. But really, our emotional strengths can be conveyed through our body language. And that final strength we spoke about was our verbal strength. So this is really, how are we using our voice to convey as much impact as possible for our audience? And again, 3 key things to think about that I've highlighted there. Think about your passion that comes across in your voice when you pitch. And when you talk about your business, most of you will be super passionate about the businesses that you're running, the ideas that you've got to put into play. Think about how you can get that passion across in your voice. And your tone of voice and your pace can really help with that as well. So we're going to go into more detail. We're going to dive deeper into voice and body language in particular. But what I mean by our pace is trying to get to a pace that's quite consistent. We tend to speak quite quickly when we're nervous because we're thinking we just want to get this out of the way. We're not very comfortable. Again, use your mindset, your mental strengths to get into as comfortable a position as possible, show up as confidently as you can, and try to slow your pace down a little bit and use pauses where possible, because that really makes someone compelling to an extent. If I said to you, think of a compelling person, and you might think of people that come to mind who are in the public eye, maybe politicians, you might think of presenters, comedians even, and also TED Talks. Many of you probably watch different TED Talks. You'll notice some techniques that they use to really become as compelling as possible. And if you can get the right pace, the right tone of voice, as well as using your body language in a way that conveys that confidence and that credibility, you're on your way to becoming much more compelling for your audience. So there are going to be some tasks that I want you to complete throughout the session today. And the first set is to ask yourself these questions. What are your strengths? So if I said to you, what are your top 3 strengths? And this doesn't necessarily need to be around communication, but it's great to be able to identify what your strengths are. Then think about what are the areas that you want to work on. And this is where I want to get specific on our communication strengths. So you might be someone that's quite confident speaking up in front of others, but you're just not making the impact that you want. Maybe you want to work on your tone of voice to get it as engaging as possible for your audience. Or maybe you want to work on your body language to come across as approachable and open as possible. Think about what areas you want to work on, and then who can help you to develop those areas. Something that I love to do is, as well, I've asked you to write down 3 key strengths that you've got. Ask some other people that know you pretty well what they would say your top 3 strengths are. It's a great tool because you can see if there's alignment, but you also might realize some strengths that you didn't think you had. So let's start to work out what our strengths are, all while thinking about what's going to make us as compelling as possible when we're communicating. The next section that I want to focus on are the pillars of communication. So when we talk about how we communicate and the ingredients that go into our communication, there's 3 key things that we focus on. You've got the words that you say, so your actual content of your pitch, your content of your conversation, for example. You've then got your body language, and then you've got your tone of voice. Those 2 things we've already been talking about quite a lot. Now, if I asked you, okay, you've got a pitch coming up in a few weeks' time, what's the first thing that you do? And where do you focus most of your time and energy when preparing for that pitch? I would anticipate that most time and energy is spent maybe developing a slide deck, maybe writing your script so you know what you want to say. And that is really important, but often that is the bulk of the effort and the energy that we put in to preparing for a pitch or a presentation, or even preparing for a conversation with a customer, a prospective customer that we want to try and buy into our product or service. Now, if I ordered these 3 things in the order of impact that they have on our audience, it would look like this. So our body language has the most impact on our audience, followed by our tone of voice, which leaves the words and the content as the least impactful part of our presentations and our pitches. Now, that's not to say that our words that we say and the content isn't important. It absolutely is. But what it does mean is that how we're presenting our content is really important, because if we're not engaging our audience with how we're showing up and presenting, then all of that effort that's gone into our slide decks, our words, our content might go in one ear and out the other and not land how we want it to. So I urge you to start to think about how you're presenting and practicing delivering your message, because how we deliver it is just as important, if not more important, than what we're actually saying. You might have the best script in the world, the most amazing slides, but if your delivery doesn't engage our audience to actually sit up and listen, then we're really losing out on them capturing and really listening to what we're saying. So just some food for thought there. Those are the key pillars of communication. And I want to look at now some tips to make an impact online as well as in person, because it's all well and good thinking, okay, we need to focus on how we're presenting, but how do we actually do that online as well as in person? And there are some similarities, but there's also some key differences as well. The first thing to think about is our positioning. We're then going to look at our background, our eye contact, and our sound. And I'm just going to come out of slides to bring this to life a little bit more. So when we think of our body language online, what I mean by position is how we positioning ourselves in the frame. More often than not, this is roughly what you'd see, head and shoulders, maybe a little bit more, depending on what works for you. Now, I'm standing at the moment delivering this workshop because that's what works for me to give me more energy when I'm presenting. You might prefer to sit down if you're delivering a pitch online, for example, which is absolutely fine. But what I would say is just try to stay as grounded as possible. So make sure your feet are flat on the floor. Make sure you're lifting up as much as possible. You're open with your positioning and you're projecting your voice as much as possible as well. So this is what I mean with our positioning. I then also mentioned background. Think about what's going on in your background when you are pitching online. A lot of people ask me about virtual backgrounds, which can be great, especially if it's a professional background. Maybe it looks like you're in an office, for example. This is a physical background that I've got. And I would sway towards using a physical background. But the main rule here is just making sure it's not distracting for your viewer. You want to be the main focus of attention when you're in a conversation with your customers, for example, or when you are stepping up to pitch your business in different situations. The next thing I mentioned is eye contact. Now, online, this is a lot more difficult than offline. When you're in person, it can be quite easy to make direct eye contact with someone in your audience. You literally catch their eye. Often we might have a little bit of a nod and reassurance that they're listening to us. Whereas online, when we're making direct eye contact with our audience, it's actually us looking at our camera lens, not at the people on our screen. And I'm hoping you can see the difference here. So with me looking here as though I could see you if we were on a Zoom call, for example, this would be me looking at you guys on the screen. Whereas this is me looking at you directly through my camera lens. And I'm hoping you can see the difference, so that builds a bit more rapport with you. So my challenge moving forward after watching today's workshop is to try to get into the habit of making eye contact, especially if you're watching this and you're operating online, doing conversations, meetings, presentations. Try to make a conscious effort to look at your camera lens, not at the screen below you. Now, I mentioned positioning there as well. Offline, this is very different because people can see all of our bodies when we're presenting in person. Imagine that we're on a stage, for example. We could use that space in a way that works for us. We might move to one side of the stage when we're making a certain point, and then when we're getting into a different part of our presentation, we might move back into the center. So there's different things to think about when we're looking at positioning and eye contact offline as well as online. The next thing I mentioned after all of that was our sound, and this has different areas that I wanted to touch on. So when we're thinking about online as well as in person, to be fair, think about the microphone that you're using. Think about how you're projecting your voice. In person, if we've got a physical audience in front of us, often we're trying to project our voice so that person at the back of the room can hear us as well as the person at the front seat. Online, we haven't got that physical audience, but we do need to try to use our mindset, similar to what we said about before, to really try to imagine that we have got this physical audience in front of us, and we are still projecting our voice as though we are presenting in person. It can be so easy to sort of get a bit quieter, not really get as animated because we haven't got that energy in the room from other people. We really want to try and get into that right mindset, thinking we are showing up, we are delivering this to an audience. It's just that the audience are on our screen, not physically with us. So there's just some tips there to start thinking about making an impact online as well as offline, especially looking at things like our body language and using our voice in a way that conveys as much confidence and as much impact as possible. So the next tasks that I want you to think about today, moving on from this topic of pillars of communication before we go on to our next one, is taking time to practice how you present. So remember what we said before, more often than not, we focus on the slide deck, the content of our script, and we think, great, we've finished it. Really put a time aside to focus on practicing how you're delivering it. How are you showing up? How's your body language? And these are the two things to do after today's session, is record your voice and watch yourself back. So two options here. It could be that you use voice notes, you record your voice and listen to it back so you can hear if you're engaging and bringing that passion forward for your audience. Or go a step further, especially if you are going to be on screen or in person delivering your presentation, to watch yourself back as well. Now, this is tough to do and it can be really challenging, but if you can get over that hurdle of let's just do it once and then you can do it again. And the reason why I say watch yourself back as well is because we'll pick up on things that we might not realize we do. Are we fiddling a bit too much? Are we swaying from side to side? Are we doing things that we didn't realize? So that's what we're trying to pick up on, ways that we can improve and enhance the impact we're having with our body language and our voice. So some extra tasks there for you. Record your voice, watch yourself back, and really put time into practice how you're pitching and how you're presenting. Okay, moving on to the next section, which is looking at some of the basics of pitching. Now, you've all got businesses or business ideas, and what I say as almost a sort of to get us in the right mindset of pitching, there are different types of pitches that we can do, but I would argue that any conversation we have with someone about our business is effectively a pitch, because we're talking about our business and we're trying to get them engaged with it. It might not be a direct customer, but that person that we're talking to may know other people that they can introduce us to, that can help move our business along further, for example, or they may know people who are potential customers that may want to buy into our product or service. So the different types of pitches, and there are so many, but I've highlighted four key ones here. The first is that elevator pitch. You might have heard of this before. This tends to be sort of your introductory pitch. If you're in a networking situation, for example, you meet someone for the first time and they say, so tell me a bit about yourself. Or so, what do you do? This is that 30-second window that we've got to really try to make as much impact as possible to introduce ourselves and our businesses. And when you think about it, 30 seconds, it doesn't sound like a lot, but you can get quite a lot into 30 seconds. I would argue that your first 10 seconds really wants to capture the audience. And we're going to be looking at sort of hooks for our audience shortly as well. But try to think of what that first opening sentence would be when someone asks you that question. You want it to come across as natural as possible, so we don't want to over-script it, but just think of the key things you want to get across when you are introducing yourself and your business, especially in those networking situations. The second example I've given is a competition pitch. So if you are part of a pitch competition where you have the opportunity to pitch in front of judges, for example, maybe for funding, for mentoring, often competition pitches are around 3 minutes long. And again, that doesn't sound long, but actually you can fit a hell of a lot into 3 minutes. So we're going to look at some of the building blocks to put into pitches shortly. But thinking about the different types of pitches, a competition pitch might be one that you deliver, more often than not, if you are going for different competitions or opportunities to get things to support your business. The third one there is your customer pitch, similar to your elevator pitch. So let's say you're meeting customers, for example, potential customers, but also here is when you've lined up maybe a call with a potential customer or a client. And this is your opportunity to really get them to buy into your product or service. Now, this is much more of a conversation, but it's still an opportunity to pitch your business. There's just a different tactic that we use for these different types of pitches. And the final one there is the investor pitch. So this will be a longer opportunity to pitch your business. When we look at the building blocks of a pitch shortly, you'll be able to go into a little bit more detail, and especially certain areas that the investors will be looking for. But those are just some ideas of the different ways and the different situations that you can use all of this content, all of these tips that we're going through today. You can apply these in different ways. And these are just some of the pitch opportunities that you might come across. So I want to highlight 2 key things when you're pitching your business. The first is to have a hook. So this is really about engaging your audience right from the start. You might have heard of the fact before around how long does it take to create a first impression. On average, and there's various bits of research into this, but on average, it takes around 7 seconds for us to form a first impression of someone, and vice versa in that case, for someone to form a first impression of us. Now, that's not to put pressure on you, but that's to think, right, we really need a good hook to get people to sit up and listen to the rest of our presentation, the rest of our pitch, to engage with that conversation we're having with our customers. So really have a hook. And there's just some ideas here. We'll go into a bit more detail when we're looking at engaging our audience, but think about maybe some facts or statistics that are quite powerful to use. Maybe a question to your audience. That could be a rhetorical question to plant the seed in their minds about something. Maybe you want to tell a story, take them on a bit of a journey, introduce some characters. All of these are different creative ways, not only to engage our audience, but it's really to have that hook right from the start, especially when we are pitching our businesses. And the second thing is to avoid jargon. Not everyone you speak to about your business is necessarily going to be in the same sector or industry that you're operating in with your business. They might not know sort of the key language or terminology that you might use within that industry. So really try to keep it simple, be really clear with your message, and avoid any jargon. I then want to go on to the building blocks of a pitch. Now, this is just going to touch on some of the key areas to start to think about. And if you've got a pen and paper, great. Hopefully you've been making notes, but these are just opportunities that you can start to think about what you would include in these different building blocks. The first 2 are really key, and often any pitch will start with these 2 key areas, and that's your problem that you're solving and your solution. So I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail now. So the problem is really where you capture your audience's attention with that hook. So how can you really get them sitting up and listening to this problem that you're solving? And then you'll follow up nicely with your solution. So you've presented to them the problem, you've now told them what your solution is. You'll then have an opportunity to go into a bit more detail about your product or service. And going back to the different types of pitches, remember that this might be more detailed in an investor pitch, for example. You might just provide the high level detail in a competition pitch, for example, the 3-minute ones that we spoke about. And then go into the market. So your target market as well as your market size. Now, the target market is ultimately, who are you targeting? Who are your customers? So knowing who your customer is, what segments are they in? Who are they? What do they do? What are their hobbies? Trying to create this customer profile so you've got an understanding and you're showing that you know who your customer is. And then also on market is the market size, especially important for investors when you're looking at what's the potential of the market that your product or service is sitting within. Afterwards, and this isn't really any order, I mean, the problem and solution would normally come first, but you can play around with this because any pitch that you do needs to be personal to you and fit with how you want to present it. But these are just some of the key building blocks. So looking at your competitors, showing that you've got an understanding of who your competitors are. More importantly than that is then highlighting what your unique selling point is. What is it that differentiates you and your business from your competitors? And really focusing on that part. Yes, highlight who your competitors are, but really focusing here on what makes you different. Another key area to include is your team and your expertise. Now, if you're a solo founder, for example, really just highlighting what your area of expertise is and making sure that the team and the expertise that you present are the right team and expertise to solve the problem that you're solving and to run the business that you're presenting. So highlighting the key areas there. This doesn't need to be too long on this slide, but it does need to make sure that you're getting across who's in the team and who's running the business. Are they the right people? And then finally, your call to action. Now, any conversation that you have with someone about your business, not only in a formal pitch that we're talking about in this section, but any conversation with a customer even, make sure you've got a call to action. What do you want them to follow up and do? Is it that you'll follow up with some further info? Is it that they need to go onto the website maybe to make a pre-order? Do they need to spread the word about it, introduce you to someone? Really thinking about what your call to action is. Because anytime you're talking about your business, maybe communicating with customers, just making sure they know what the next step is key. So those are just some building blocks of a pitch to think about. And your task for this section is to start to think about some notes to make for each of those areas. What are the kind of things that you'd want to include? Remember to keep it simple. And another key tip here is to apply the so what question. So the reason why I say this is, let's say that you've developed your script, you've read it out, think about every part of your script and every part of your pitch. Is there an opportunity for someone to ask, so what? It might mean, if that is the case, it may mean you need to go into a bit more detail, or you could take it out altogether, especially if you're on a tight time frame. But the key task here is really to start thinking about those pitch building blocks. Even if you haven't got a pitch coming up in the near future, there are going to be opportunities to pitch your business and also to talk to your customers as well. And this will just give you that opportunity to really formulate some key information about your business that you can start to talk to people about. So that's your task moving forward from today as well. Okay, and then we're going to look at engaging our audience. So this is that final piece that we're talking about, the final part of today's session. We've already looked at compelling people, ways that we can be really compelling with our communication style. We've then looked at the key pillars of communication. So the importance of your non-verbal communication, your body language, then your voice, and also the words that come into that as well. We explored your mindset and really going into the right mindset with these situations. And then we've just looked at sort of the basics of pitching and those building blocks to start thinking about. So now we really want to think about how do we engage our audience and capture their attention. And the real aim here is to build rapport, to really try and connect authentically, especially when we're talking about connecting with your customers. You want it to be an authentic connection and the opportunity to show empathy as well. Now, the reason why I highlight authenticity there is because you might see people presenting, pitching, talking to customers in a style that you think, God, that's really great. That's how I want to come across. That's my style of pitching and presenting that I want to do. But remember that you're going to find your own style with this. Make sure it's authentic to you because you want to show up genuine and natural when you're in these opportunities to communicate with your customers and pitch your business. Now, different ways to build rapport. I want to highlight 3 C's to think about when you're going into these opportunities to communicate with customers and pitching. So make sure you've got a really clear message. The last thing you want to do is confuse your customer, confuse your audience. That's going to lose that rapport there. Make sure you've got real clarity with what you're saying. Try to make sure you've got a confident approach. And this all comes into what we've spoken about already today. Your body language will have an impact on this. Your voice will have an impact on this. Your mindset, how you're showing up. So really trying to get into this confident approach, because that's going to help the other person engage with you and think, right, they know what they're talking about. I'm engaged with what they're saying. And then the final C there is being quite creative, especially with your content. So creative ways of having that hook, for example, creative ways of building that rapport, but really presenting your content in a compelling way. And so creativity can really come in nicely here. So when we think about connecting with your customer in particular, but also in other pitch scenarios, 3 things to think about. Really make sure you're tailoring your message. So if it's customers that you're speaking to, make sure you're tailoring it to the benefits that they're going to get from your product and service, for example. Target their pain points. What do they want to gain from your product or service? So tailoring your message. If you're delivering a pitch, then not everyone in that audience is necessarily going to be a customer. Try and do your research on who is going to be in the audience of those situations. But when we're talking about connecting with your customer, make sure you're tailoring it and tailoring your message. Don't forget to get them interested and use those techniques that we mentioned before. Things like stories. Stories are great because they are memorable and people can often relate to the characters that we bring to life with the stories as well. Using questions, using facts, all of these things that are bringing the problem that you're solving to life as best as possible and really keeping our audience engaged. When I talk about engaging our audience, I have to speak about questions before we wrap up as well. So dealing with questions as effectively as possible, because if we're looking at a pitch, for example, what we've spoken about so far is the preparation that goes into a pitch. You've gone a step further than just scripting and getting your slides sorted. You're actually going to practice how you're delivering your message. I then want you to go a step further than that and prepare for potential questions that you might get in a pitch scenario from judges, from audience members, but also when you're talking to people about your business. And when questions come up, try to remember those, because then you've got answers when someone might ask the same thing further down the line. So key tips here when dealing with questions: make sure you're listening to the question. Often we're so passionate when we're talking about our business. We might, have a lot of adrenaline and a lot of excitement when we're talking about our business. When someone asks us a question, really make sure you're listening to what it is they're asking you. It might be that you need them to repeat the question, which is absolutely fine. Once you know what they're asking, focus on what you do know. If it's a question that you think, oh, this kind of relates to this point that I made, so maybe I can focus on that. You're trying to steer the question in a way that you can answer it as confidently as possible. So acknowledging the question is always great. It's a great question. It relates to what I was speaking about earlier on ABC. So focusing on what you do know, because then you're coming across as credible and confident as possible, because you're showing that you do know certain areas of the question they're asking. If it's a question that you're thinking, I absolutely have no idea how I'm going to answer this, I don't have the information they're asking for, then always go with the honest approach. The last thing you want to be doing in a Q&A is blagging an answer, because people will see through it. So be really, really honest. It might be that you acknowledge the question. It's a great question. I don't have all the information to be able to give you a full answer now. However, I would like to follow up and be able to send this to you afterwards. Just an example there of how you could confidently explain that you don't have all the information that you need for that answer, but you can follow up. And I've put follow up on there as a point, because if you say you're going to do something, make sure you do it. So those are the key pointers with dealing with questions. Just a little bit of a side bonus tips that I wanted to bring in, because I think it's such a key part when we are talking about communicating with customers and pitching our businesses. So your task for this section is to really research your customer, and going a step further, if it's pitching your business in different situations, try to know who's in the audience so you can tailor your message for those people as well. Prepare for questions as much as possible and really remain authentic to you. Be authentic. Don't try and be someone that you're not. Don't try and replicate other people's style, because you'll find your own, and that's going to come across so much more impactfully as well. I hope that has been useful. That has been 4 key areas of communication, looking at compelling people, the pillars of communication, the basics of pitching, and also engaging your audience. Fingers crossed, you've got some tips to take away there. I really encourage you to start putting a lot of those into practice straight away. Good luck with your pitches and your communication with your customers, and best of luck.